Open source is people coming together to collaboratively solve problems. And we've got lots of tools like copyright and patents that we need to work around. But at the end of the day, open source is about collaboratively solving problems and not having to reinvent the wheel every time we need to accomplish something.
Hi, this is your host Abdul Bhartiya, and we are here at Open Source Summit in Seattle. And today we have with us David Nalley, Director of Open Source Strategy at AWS. David, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here, especially on the show floor with so much going on around us.
Yes, there is so much going on, and the biggest news is the announcement of Valkey. Talk a bit about what happened that led to creation of this project.
A couple of weeks ago, the company who was the steward for the Redis open source project decided that they were going to make a license change to the core engine of Redis, and that change was actually moving to 2 possible licenses, and both of those licenses did not meet the open source definition. So essentially, it was a transition from open source to source available. In response to that, a number of the contributors to Redis, who were not Redis employees, decided to basically fork the project. They wanted to continue working on it and contributing to it, and so they did that. And very shortly thereafter, the project had a name. It moved to the Linux Foundation, so it became a project at the Linux Foundation. And then really the community support seemed to kind of coalesce right around it.
Why AWS decided to support this project?
Obviously, is the Elasticache and MemoryDB businesses that our customers depend upon. And we have a large number of customers who really value those services. So first of all, we've got to take care of our customers. In the days that were following the announcement of the license change, one of the first things that happened was that one of the principal engineers who had been contributing to the Redis open source project for 6 years, had been a maintainer on the project for 4 years, and was part of the core group that was making governance decisions for Redis prior to this license change. She went to her management and said, I know that AWS is going to figure out how to respond to this, but I and other people who are working on the project want to continue working on it. Is it okay if I fork this into my personal GitHub account and just continue the development work that we already had planned? Her management chain, to their credit, gave her permission to do that. She did that. The other maintainer that was not a Redis employee joined her there. Then a huge mass of other large contributors to the project, and I'm talking about individuals, not companies at this point. They started coalescing around this, and this is still living in this single engineer's personal GitHub repo. And as AWS was looking at what was happening and trying to figure out how to respond to this to support our customers, we're seeing that the community of contributors had coalesced around this. And suddenly it made perfect sense for us to say, that's where the community is, that's where we need to be. And so the fact that the community coalesced so quickly made it an obvious choice for us to go support that.
Can you also talk about the role of AWS in this project?
Today, Valkey is a project at the Linux Foundation. There is, in terms of governance, there is a technical steering committee. There are 6 individuals on that technical steering committee. Only one of those is an Amazon employee, but that maintainership is not on behalf of AWS. That is something that person earned in their own right. And so if they left AWS tomorrow, we would not have a maintainer. In terms of trying to support, we're certainly recognizing that the community has made a decision. And specifically when I'm talking about community, I mean the community of contributors, the people who were doing the work before. I think Madeline Olson is the principal engineer from AWS who is a maintainer on Valkey. She was telling me that the 6 maintainers have over 1,000 commits and 26 years of contributing to Redis before the license change happened. And so, you know, what we want to do is we want to make sure that this community has the support it needs. We don't, to be perfectly frank with you, we don't know what that's going to be today. We're certainly allocating development resources today, and we're certainly supportive of this moving to the Linux Foundation. And you've seen from, I assume, the press releases and the announcements that we're standing behind Valkey as our version of what will replace Redis. But we don't know what that's going to take place. So it is not the case that AWS is leading this project. There is an AWS employee on the technical steering committee, but there's no AWS benevolent dictator or anything of that nature. We have a voice in the community, but the voice is owned by someone who earned that independently. A couple of things I want to call out about Valkey specifically. Yesterday, on stage at Open Source Summit North America, the first generally available version of Valkey was released, 7.2.5. You can get container images. There are packages for your favorite Linux distribution available, or of course you can download and compile it yourself. You should certainly be looking at some of the conversations going on in the forums and on GitHub, because there's a lot of excitement and folks wanting to push the level of innovation inside Redis right now. And so if you care about Redis or you care about key value stores, Valkey is the place where innovation is being pushed. And so pay attention to that. I think you're going to see a lot of activity out of this community. They are excited and invigorated, and it is every single day I see a much larger group of people contributing to the project. I'm super excited about it, and frankly, I'm excited and I'm on the sidelines because you know, I don't know that they'd let me contribute. I may not be smart enough to contribute to a key value store database.
Of course, it's a bit technical question. How does the Valkey community plan to maintain a cadence with Redis?
So, not speaking for the maintainers, right? And I will be very upfront. I am not a contributor to Valkey. I was not a contributor to Redis. And so, you know, please don't take my answers as authoritative because I do not speak for the project. But, you know, I don't think that it's any longer a concern. I think, you know, prior to this license change, the community had a lot of features that were on the roadmap and that they plan to include. There's been a lot of additional features that have been proposed since this license change, and other people wanting to get involved, including folks from other previous forks of Redis that happened before the license change. And so I actually suspect that they will diverge, right? So because it is a fork, same in functionality right now, I don't think there's going to be any, we're going to go chase all of the features that Redis proposes. I think that the Valkey community will make independent decisions. We would be happy if people looked at what Valkey did and took it. You know, if Redis wanted to come along and say, hey, we really appreciate this feature, the license would certainly allow them to take that, and we would welcome them to take the work that's done there. We would be happy to service the upstream. But I don't think there will be any looking back at, well, what's Redis doing? Do we need to copy that? I don't think that's going to happen. I think this community still has items on the roadmap that they had planned to implement in Redis, in the next version of Redis. I think they will continue to deliver that. I think, though, that no one's going to be looking out the window and saying, what's Redis doing today, and trying to copy it.
Maybe one day Redis will come and join the project as its upstream.
We would certainly welcome that. They're more than welcome to take portions or all of the code. The BSD license certainly permits that, and we'd be happy for that to happen.
Of course, in the open source world, you know, these kind of hiccups, bumps keep happening. But in the last couple of years, we have seen a disturbing trend where companies are changing licenses. Um, do you see that this trend is really disturbing, or you feel, hey, this is what happens in the open source world? We will course correct, or you are really worried about these trends?
I'm obviously concerned about trends as they develop. In particular, this one, it seems to be born out of some changes in the macroeconomic environment, as well as folks being concerned about their ongoing business. And so from a business perspective, I think this was the choice for Redis Inc. to make. It was up to them as to whether to make that choice or not, and that they chose to do that. I wish them well in that. At the same time, there's this body of contributors who are not Redis employees, who've been contributing to the Redis open source project for many years. And while we're talking about this specific situation in terms of trends, that pattern has played out a number of times. It does concern me because it feels like a little bit like a rug pull for those contributors to open source. And they were not expecting a change in the terms of the license. They were not consulted about a change in the terms of the license. And so in some ways, the concern that I have is really one of people being disenfranchised. They were given the ability to submit code and contribute code. They were given the ability to become maintainers, have the right to commit code directly into the code base, to make governance decisions, and then essentially disenfranchised. And that's the thing that I'm mostly worried about. Businesses will make decisions that are in their own best interests, hopefully, and certainly within their rights to do so. My concern in terms of the trend is that we are disenfranchising the body of contributors that have existed before.
Do these changes that companies are making setting a wrong precedent for new companies where they will now be thinking twice that should they start as an open source company or they should go the proprietary way? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it does reflect the difficulty of actually running a business, particularly in open source. You have to balance the value that you're creating by creating open source software that's available to everyone versus what is your product. And that's a difficult thing to do. Running a software company is not an easy task. At the same time, open source is much more than a business or a business model. As a matter of fact, I don't think open source is a business model at all. But open source is a community of folks who are trying to come together to solve problems collaboratively. And I do worry about the long-term impact of that collaborative commons where we come together and solve problems and get to benefit by effectively standing on the shoulders of giants.
If you look at OpenTofu or if we look at Valkey, are these projects sending a message to these companies that just like trying to solve a business problem through license change is not going to work out because the community will band together and they will create alternatives which are backed by a larger community, and it might deter companies from doing that in future?
I think you're right. You cannot beat this long term. Forking is not a new mechanism that just sprang up in response to this. Forking has always been a relief valve that open source has, that if a significant enough community is willing to stand behind it, they can fork a project and go in a different direction. And that may be a different technical direction, it may be a different licensing direction, but it is essentially a relief valve that open source has built in.
I also want to talk about, when we look at AWS, how important is open source for AWS?
Open source is incredibly important to AWS for really three reasons. The first is that AWS wouldn't exist today if it didn't have open source to build on. When you look at the early days of S3, it was built atop Apache Tomcat. The early days of EC2 was built atop the Zen hypervisor. Open source is in the DNA of the services that we provided from the very earliest days. Second is that our customers love open source, and that is why we are increasingly involved in open source. Customers are telling us we want open source databases, we want open source tools like PyTorch for machine learning, and so our customers are essentially demanding that we not only make it easy for them to run those open source tools, and we do that in the way of services, but also that we get involved in open source and essentially have to advocate on behalf of our customers. And then finally, we also recognize that we've got a little bit of a shared destiny, because open source underlies not just AWS's services and tooling, but also the rest of the world. Everyone consumes open source. And so we have to, we believe that at our scale, that we have broad responsibilities to the larger ecosystem. And our responsibility to open source is a part of that.
When you look at open source, it can easily solve day one problem if you have all the resources. But what about day two, day three, day four? You need additional functionality. You want to be able to run at scale. And that's when I see the importance of commercialization around open source, where companies like AWS make these technologies more accessible to people. So talk about the commercial aspect of open source, the role that companies are like AWS are playing, which I see is another form of contribution to open source.
A lot of the part of the value of AWS, we have a number of open source databases. You can download those databases and operate them yourself, and that's great. You can do the same thing inside AWS and use a managed service and remove a lot of the overhead of actually operating the underlying database. And so that's the value that we're trying to provide. It's not that we're trying to go above and beyond and do something completely different than open source is. Our customers are demanding open source. They trust open source. We're trying to make it easy for them to adopt open source.
I have had this discussion with a couple of folks in the open source world, with OSI also, that when we look at these trends, I see that companies are trying to solve a business problem through license changes. Is it really an ideal situation? Because sometimes companies blame hyperscalers, AWS, Microsoft, or Google, that, hey, they're taking our work and they are not contributing back. The fact is that you folks are contributing. But going back to the point of the license, it is about copyright. And it was written in a time when you have to download the code, and when you redistribute the code, you should also redistribute the changes depending on the license you're using. But in the cloud world, I'm not downloading anything, I'm not redistributing anything, so I'm not even, the license that code was released under is not even forcing or requiring me to release those changes. And then the fact is that I'm not redistributing anything, so sometimes I find it hard to go with their argument of trying to solve a business problem with the license problem. But let's look at a pragmatic, positive side of it. What are the alternatives? What is the ideal solution? Do we need a new license, which is more suitable for this world? Or what is the right approach so that companies don't resort to changing license to solve a business problem?
I think it is important to go look at some of the history of both the open source and the free software movement. And particularly, the free software movement was good about codifying the why of why we are creating these constraints or lack of constraints. And, if you look at the four freedoms, Freedom 2 and Freedom 3, both explicitly talk about helping other people. And so the goal of free software was essentially so that other people could solve a problem and then share that to help people around them. And so the licenses are an artifact of what we thought the constraint was. And, I look at the Open Infra Foundation, and they talk about the various opens, open governance, open development, and of course, an open source license. the open source license is solving one problem, typically only one problem, and that is around copyright. And we thought that was the constraint years ago. And so I do think we've seen some developments. The AGPL is another license that adds some restrictions and changes the trigger point for what used to be distribution. And I think that's a great novel solution to things. If you're concerned about the fact that people are not distributing software the way that we used to, handing out CDs or making downloads available. But I go back to the point that copyright is one of the constraints on the system, and we created licenses to deal with that. But the spirit of open source is about being able to help people around you. And if you don't want to do that, and that's a perfectly fine thing to say that you want to do. You may want to for your business to make money, and a proprietary license is the right license for your business. I don't have any qualms about saying that sometimes that is the right choice. But if you want to be in open source, the reality is it needs to be accessible to everyone. If you want to carry that moniker and the ethos of open source, it's about helping people, largely without restriction.
And that kind of makes me wonder, if I ask you, how would you define open source in today's modern world?
Open source is people coming together to collaboratively solve problems. And we've got lots of tools like copyright and patents that we need to work around. But at the end of the day, open source is about collaboratively solving problems and not having to reinvent the wheel every time we need to accomplish something.
David, thank you so much for joining me today and talk about Valkey and the larger open source landscape, open source at AWS. Thanks for those great insights, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.